Hey there, Dango Stu here. Today's video is about what to do if you break down on the water. First mate on today's adventure is Dane Cowan there in Singapore. I left my phone at the workshop. He told me what marina that was. It's also apparently not his boat. I think he's lying. He kind of looks familiar. So if I broke down on the water, the first thing I'd do is just assess the situation the vessel itself's in. You know, are you blowing towards rocks? Are you in a really busy channel? All that kind of stuff. In this case, it's a really calm day. You've got to be lucky sometimes because that's good for filming. But what I will do is I'll just throw an anchor out. So an anchor is essentially a part of your safety equipment. It certainly is in New South Wales anyway. And it's exactly for this reason that it's considered safety equipment and not a fishing accessory or whatever. A lot of people in ski boats say, oh, I don't fish, I only ski, I don't bring an anchor, but they're actually required to carry one by law for this exact situation. In this case, I'm going to anchor from the stern of the vessel because it's a really calm day, so it won't really matter. I generally leave it at the back here because we tend to anchor at the back and tie towards the front, just the way these boats are used a lot. But ideally, if it was rough, you'd have it anchored from the bow. I think we're in about 10 metres of water here, possibly even a bit less. But because it's calm, I'm only going to put out 10 or 15 metres of rope. You would definitely need a bit more scope if you were in worse weather. I've got a video I did with Paul on anchoring a boat, so I'll put a link to that. Ah, that reminds me. Dane in the photo, he used to live with Paul and I for about a year. Yeah, that's it. Alright, now the boat's secure, we can start turning our attention to what's actually the problem with the motor. What I'm going to do first is just look at all the really general things as though you were just trying to start a boat normally. I've seen plenty of situations where these kill switches have just been knocked and come out. People start running around ripping the cowling off and all they have to do is plug this back in. The symptom of that, as you probably know, is that it'll crank but it won't fire. So it'll sit there turning over and over and over, no spark. The other thing that can cause cranking and no start is simply running out of fuel. So that'd be the next thing I'd check if I'd confirm the kill switch was in. In the case of the grey machine, I've got a simple external tank here. So by simply feeling the weight of it, I can see how much fuel's in it. It's definitely not empty. But I've got to confess, it's actually a bit lower than I thought it was. The next thing I'd check is that you've got this fuel tank breather open. If this fuel tank breather is closed, and you've been doing a fair bit of particularly full throttle running, you'll get a vacuum inside the tank, or a partial vacuum, and the fuel pump will stop being able to pull fuel through, the motor will stall, and it might be hard to start again. It'll slowly probably leak a little bit of air in, but that could be a problem as well. Another thing you can check without taking the cowling off relates to a different problem, which is where you have the motor not cranking as opposed to cranking and not starting. And that's simply a flat battery. You've been driving along, you've turned the motor off, you've done a bit of fishing, perhaps you've had a couple of nav lights on or just a work light if you're there at night, and you go to turn the motor and it either doesn't crank at all or it just doesn't have enough strength to turn over enough to fire. In that situation, presuming you don't have a jump start pack with you, which is a great thing to carry, dual batteries or anything like that, I would just check your terminals. They can be a little bit loose, they can be a bit corroded. Taking them off, cleaning them up with a little bit of sandpaper and that kind of thing, and then putting them back together might be enough to get the boat started again. Speaking of the sandpaper, I'll now just quickly go through some of the tools I think is good to carry on a boat before we get into sort of taking the cowling off and doing more diagnostics under there. I've got a few more tools here than I would normally perhaps carry on a boat recreationally, only because I use this boat to go and do sort of mobile mechanic type work. But I'll show you what I would carry if it was just a recreational boat. So first I'll show you just a couple of things we've already mentioned. First is a little jump starter pack like this. This has a couple of alligator clips that go in here and is essentially sort of a smaller modern version of your classic sort of lead acid jump starter pack. So a really good way to give yourself a bit of self-sufficiency with regards to dealing with a flat battery. The other thing is a little bit of this sort of fine wet and dry sandpaper. It's really good for cleaning up electrical connectors, cleaning up spark plugs, all that kind of stuff. So then carrying a small sheet of this is really handy as well. Next, and I guess most obviously, is just a basic set of hand tools. I would have minimum sort of Phillips head and flathead screwdrivers, a little 1/4-inch ratchet with an extension, and a set of sockets for that. This tin is an old tobacco tin that I use for the sockets. I also keep just a few split pins in, like a propeller split pin, that sort of thing. Super handy pliers for all the things you can't think of. You know, they're just really good for fetching little parts that have dropped down that you can't reach, things your fingers aren't strong enough for, all sorts of things. These ones also have wire cutters built in, but separate side cutters are probably a good thing to carry too. The other thing I carry on the hand tool section is just a whole set of spanners. The only real specialist tool I carry as such is a spark plug socket. That way I know I've just got the exact right socket and a good handle just to get the spark plugs out to check them if I need to. Of course, a can of Start Your Bastard never goes astray either. For me, it's not so much about getting the boat started, although obviously by its name, that's kind of what it's for. But to me, it's also a good diagnostic tool. If you're cranking a boat and it won't start, and you spray a bit of this starting fluid in, and it fires even momentarily, you know that your problem's fuel related, not spark related. I also carry a hammer just for when you get annoyed. A little bit of a WD-40 sort of water displacement spray I think is a really good thing. It's a great sort of temporary lubricant, maybe for steering or something, good for getting water out of electrical connectors, that kind of thing. So it's worth having just one, even a sort of a smaller can of that. I think WD make one down to sort of, you know, this size, quite small, which is great as an emergency thing. On the electrical side, I carry a Stanley knife, which I use for stripping wires, that kind of thing, but it can be used for lots of stuff, as you know. Bit of just standard electrical tape, great for, you know, where you've got a problem where a wire's rubbed through and it's shorting, you can tape it up, back in action. I also carry one of these. I don't actually carry a multimeter on the boat, I just carry one of these sort of auto probes, and they're really good for diagnosing 12-volt problems. They clip onto your battery. They don't have a battery internally, so I guess the one downside is if your battery is so dead it can't even run a piece of electronics like this. Probably doesn't do you much good, but most of the time I find this a really good way to diagnose problems on a boat. So we'll use this a little bit when we get the cowling off. It's also in my electrical kit that I keep these side cutters, which are a little bit more effective than trying to use the sort of cutting blade on the inside of these long nose pliers. So tool-wise, that's about it, to be honest with you. I'm sure other people have got things they like to carry, so feel free to put those in the comments. But I'll now just go into what I also carry in the way of spares. Spares-wise, I carry a set of spark plugs. I think they're something that the old ones could be cleaned up with that wet and dry sandpaper, but they're just so small that I don't see any harm. I also carry a spare lanyard, the sort of dead man switch or overboard switch, but if you don't have one of these, there are ways to get by without one. That actually brings me neatly to another sort of spare or thing I would carry, which is cable ties. You can use a cable tie to just pull the lanyard switch out, wrap a cable tie around it and tighten it, and that'll hold the switch out so you can start the motor and run. Larger cable ties I think are also good to carry. It's a bit like the cyanide pills they had on the sort of space missions. They say, you know, it's not so much for the things you can think of, it's all the things you can't think of. I'm only joking, they're really for handcuffing pirates. I would also carry a full set of fuses. So just have a look at what your boat carries. It might have a mixture of these sort of glass fuses and some blade fuses of all different sizes, so I think it's really good to have a full set of those. I also carry a little bit of two-stroke oil, even though it's a four-stroke, so that's just weird. Beyond that, I don't carry much. You could, if you were really worried and you're going offshore, perhaps carry a prop and a split pin and that kind of thing, because if a prop comes off, you know, you're not going anywhere. The trouble with spare parts, I think, is you can just go too far. You can start carrying so much stuff. The ultimate spare part really is a second outboard. Just have a little kicker. If there's a problem, fire that up, putt home. That is the ultimate spare. If you don't have a second motor, by law in New South Wales you have to carry a paddle, and the easiest way to paddle a boat this size is to actually sit on the bow with your legs hanging over the front and then just do alternate left-right strokes across the bow of the boat. You won't go fast, you certainly won't beat a current, but if you're just trying to get back to the nearest wharf or the shore, sitting on the bow will make it pretty easy to steer the boat and get where you're trying to go. Let's go pop the cowling off now. So I'm going to turn the helm to starboard just so we can sort of look at the side of the boat a little bit, and we'll have a look at a few things you can check if all the basics have checked out to be okay and it's something more serious. I've got the two positive and negative alligator clips of this auto probe connected to my battery now, and so the display has come up showing 0 volts. And wherever I touch this single probe to now, it'll give me a voltage reading. So if I put this onto the positive terminal of the battery, I can read the battery voltage. So it'll give me a sense of whether my battery's flat or not, particularly if I put it on the terminal and try and crank it. If you're cranking the engine and reading the voltage shouldn't drop below 10 volts if the battery's healthy. If it wasn't firing, one of the first things I'd do, really, I think, was just give it that spray. If it fires momentarily, you know you've got spark and you can rule that whole side of things out. You can also check for spark by just taking a spark plug out, grounding it against the body of the engine block, the casing of the engine block, and turning the motor over. That's a lot easier if you've got two people, but as we go through using this probe, which I actually got from J-Car, to be honest with you, I think there is a brand called an auto probe. I actually think it's a particular sort of proprietary brand, which I believe is quite high quality. This is a cheaper one that I got from J-Car, made by Digitech. So if you can afford the good one, great. If not, I think these are about $70. So what this probe will do for you basically, if you look down here, I've got this light, and if I touch it to an earth, that little negative light comes on. So I know that's an earth. I don't necessarily know it's a great earth, but I know it is a functioning earth. Enough to trigger this anyway. This terminal on the solenoid is where the main battery lead comes in. So if I touch to here, I'll get a reading. In this case, 12.5 volts. So that's how many volts are getting to that point. Could be very low current if it's a high resistance circuit, but we know we are getting 12.5 to that point. When you turn the key on this boat, current comes to this terminal on the solenoid, and when it does, it allows current to flow from this terminal here, this bigger one, to this one, and from this one to the starter motor. The great thing about these probes is they can not just test power, but they can supply power. If you press it down, you can supply a ground, and if you press it up, you can supply plus 12 volts. So if I touch to this terminal and then press up on here, it'll provide current which will allow it to start. The great thing about that is it allows me to start the boat or turn it over from here at the outboard, which means if I'm trying to check for spark, I can do it on my own rather than needing someone at the front turning the key and me being at the back here looking for spark. If you were turning the key and the motor wasn't cranking at all, and then you applied 12 volts to the starter solenoid and it fired like that, you know you've got a problem with your key mechanism up there or the loom between the forward controls and the outboard. Also, just to be clear, you can do that with literally a set of pliers. All you need to do is take power from the main positive into the solenoid across to the activation terminal just by getting your two pliers and touching them, and you achieve the same effect. If that does work, then you can just start it manually this way or start trying to diagnose what's wrong with your key. Maybe just the mechanism's a bit dicky, you need to wiggle it a bit, whatever. The other situation might be where it's cranking like that, but it never actually fires, and that's when you want to look for spark. Now, I've got to confess, this Honda doesn't use the spark plugs that spark plug remover's for. That kit that I carry isn't really for this boat, it's more just for general work I do. Now, other than using the spray, I can take a spark plug out, hold it against the casing, and as I crank using this technique so I can be here at the same time, I want to see if a spark's going across the electrode on the spark plug. To test for spark, I'm going to take a spark plug out, leave it into its HT lead, hold the body of the spark plug against the casing in the motor so it's got a ground, and then I'm going to use this to supply power to the solenoid to get the motor to turn over. Here's use sort of 4mm63 for zip ties, which is you can just zip tie your spark plug against a metal part of the outboard to give it a ground. That way you don't have to hold it at the same time. Once I've got my spark plug set up, I can either turn the key or get someone else to turn the key and have a look, or use a jumper wire, a probe like this, to crank the motor over and look for spark in that electrode. It's a little bit hard to see in daylight, but you'll probably hear it more than you'll see it. If I had spark, the next thing I'd look for is just whether there's fuel in the carburettor bowls. It's a nice quick check and it lets you know whether you've got fuel in there or not, or if you've actually got water in the carburettor bowls as well. On this Honda, the carburettors are here on the starboard side, and these little plugs at the bottom, this is the carburettor bowl, we're expecting to have fuel in it, and these little plugs, I'll actually do the bottom one so it doesn't run over, the fuel doesn't run over all the others. All I need to do is just open it up, and you can see there hopefully that fuel's starting to run out. So I'll close that off. If you've got fuel in those carburettor bowls, then you kind of know your fuel pump's working, you haven't run out of fuel yet, all that kind of stuff. If there was water in there, and you can tell because as soon as that fuel hits the lower cowling, you'll see the water bead, whereas the fuel sort of just seems to spread quite smoothly, but the water will form into droplets, so you'll be able to tell straight away if there's water in there rather than fuel, or water in the fuel. If those carburettor bowls are empty, then fuel's your problem. If I was to spray a bit of starter fluid in, it would fire, but as soon as that fluid was consumed, it would stall again. So once again, we know we got spark, but we know we're not getting fuel, and that's confirmed by the carburettor bowls being empty. That can be caused by running out of fuel, the fuel line being blocked in some way. If you can smell fuel, it's obviously a fuel leak somewhere, but it can also be caused by the fuel pump failing. If the fuel pump has failed, you can simply squeeze this primer bulb to refill those bowls, those carburettor bowls. If you're on your own, you can kind of squeeze it, idle, get where you're going, you know, it'll use the fuel in the carburettor bowls, run out, pump it again, whatever. But if you're with two people, somebody can simply keep pumping the primer bulb the whole time you're driving, and you'll keep those carburettors fed. EFI is a different story, you need that high pressure pump to be working for EFI, but in a carburettor motor, if there's two of you, just simply squeezing the bulb the whole time you're travelling along will help you get past a bad fuel pump. If the fuel pump is leaking on the diaphragm side though, you'll probably just end up squeezing fuel into the crankcase. So in a 4-stroke, you'll actually just start what they call making oil. You'll dilute the oil with fuel. And in a 2-stroke, it'll probably just start running really rich because it's going into the crankcase and then ultimately ending up back in the cylinders. But if it's just the one-way valves or it's not pumping, then using the bulb can get you out of trouble. If you turn the key, nothing happens, then you can try and activate this solenoid if it's a problem with the key. If you hear the solenoid clicking, but it's not turning over, it either means you've got a problem with the starter motor itself or the leads going to the starter motor. So once again, check your connections. Loose or corroded connections are a pretty common cause of problem on boats, and they're a nice, easy one to fix in the field if you've got a couple of spanners, a bit of spray, and a bit of sandpaper. Never underestimate the power of just having a look around. When I was doing some marine engineering at college, I remember one of the first day the instructor said, right, first step is, you know, take the engine cover off. Second step is put your hands in your pocket. Just have a look. Don't touch anything yet. Just have a good look and see if anything looks wrong. Quite often, you know, bad connections, loose cables, dropped linkages, worn wire casings, all these kind of things, they're quite noticeable visibly. Leaks, can you smell fuel, all that kind of stuff. You don't really need to be an expert to know when something doesn't look right. If when you turn the key or you apply power to the solenoid, it doesn't click, it doesn't necessarily mean your starter motor's out of action. You may find that your key's working well, it's just the actual mechanism inside the solenoid. You get a bit of spark and you need to be able to take quite a bit of current through whatever you're using, like a big set of pliers or something. But you can, I'll show you here. Before we were applying power here, which is a low current power that activates the solenoid and allows power to pass from this terminal to this terminal, which is from the battery to the terminal connecting the starter motor. But you can just bridge these two with a large pair of sort of insulated pliers. It's a bit dodgy, there's spark, if there's fuel somewhere, it'll light, all that kind of stuff. But having said that though, it is a way to temporarily put power to the starter motor, get the motor started and get back if you're stuck somewhere where you really can't get back any other way. When I was talking about running out of fuel, something I forgot to mention is that in your spares, obviously spare fuel is a good thing. I personally don't carry it, not because it isn't a great thing, but because I go quite short distances, something I find is that my motor anyway, will run out of fuel and will stall. And then I can actually tip the tank so that the fuel runs to the side of the tank that has the pickup. So just simply lift the tank a bit, get it to the pickup, prime the bulb, and that's enough to get me back to shore. So it's almost like a bit of a sort of reserve tank mechanism. It's not by design, it's just a bit of a thing that happens. But if you do run out, you feel a tiny bit of fuel in the bottom of the tank, just tilt it as much as you can towards, so it all runs down towards the pickup where the fuel hose goes in, and then just start priming while you've got it at that angle. It'll be enough to fill your fuel filters, fill your carburetor bowls again, and maybe just get you to the nearest point. Other problems you can have are things like the throttle not working, not going into gear. In that case, you can disconnect throttle linkages and things and actually operate it manually. Be careful with moving parts, you know, flywheels, timing belts, all that kind of stuff. But it is an option, if it's a forward control option, to actually manually operate the outboard from inside the cowling. So something else to consider if that's the type of problem you've got. But once again, just be careful where your fingers are, particularly if the motor's running. If you can't get your starter motor going at all, a lot of boats have an emergency pull start, even if it isn't a pull start motor. This one doesn't have it, but often the kit is taped up under the inside of the cowling, and it'll simply be a starter rope with a knot at one end that you hook in these sort of teardrop shaped cutouts, and then just a small T-piece handle. And that'll let you pull this motor over. You'll have to wind it every time, pull start it. It can be quite hassly, particularly if it takes 3 or 4 times to start. But if your starter motor dies and you've got that emergency pull start kit, which I recommend having, I should have it, I can't show you one because I don't have it here, but it is a way to get a motor started up to, I don't know, probably about 70 horsepower. If you remember when we supplied power to the solenoid to make the starter motor start, that power is normally fed when you turn the key. So 12 volts runs from the motor up to the key. When you turn the key, the 12 volts goes back and goes to that solenoid. If you turn the key and nothing happens, also check your fuses, because that 12 volt power that goes up to the key is fused. It's only a small current, so it can take a fuse, unlike the starter motor leads themselves, the high amp leads. But if that fuse blows, you turn the key, absolutely nothing will happen. The starter motor won't start, the solenoid won't click. So that's a bit of a clue that there's a fuse you should check as well. Usually that's under the cowling. So if you have some sort of steering problem, there are a few ways you can go there. If the steering's completely failed, you can use a rope to lash the paddle of an oar to the side of the outboard, then use the oar as a tiller, so you can have a homemade sort of tiller. You can also put an oar into the water, lash somewhere at the midpoint and use it as sort of a makeshift rudder, so that's another option as well if you've got some sort of steering trouble. If you're in the situation where you've looked at all the things you can and you can't get the boat started, obviously then you need to get help from someone. So the first important thing there is that just make sure you're carrying enough water and that kind of stuff, hats. You don't want to be in a situation where you're getting really thirsty, really hot in the boat while you're waiting perhaps hours for someone to come along and give you a hand. So once you've got that sort of squared away, the next thing you need is some means of contacting people. In this day and age, mobile phones are pretty effective. Most people boat within mobile phone range. There's plenty of people you can call. There's New South Wales Maritime, the police, various sort of marine rescue organisations, all that kind of thing. If you're outside mobile phone range, you're going to want to look at some options that are more targeted at people in your proximity. And those will be your marine radios, so 27 meg or VHF radio, flares, things like a V-sheet so helicopters can see you. They're kind of your main ways of contacting people and saying, hey, look, I need some assistance. Well, that about wraps it up for today. I guess to summarise, first thing is look at the basics. Don't panic, check your kill switch, check your fuel, all those kinds of things, your battery. If you do go to the point of taking the cowling off and seeing what's wrong, just stop and have a good look first. Carrying a basic set of tools, basic set of spares, they don't take up a lot of room, even in a small boat like this, and they really can sort of save your bacon when you get in trouble. If you can't get the boat going and you have to get to shore yourself, you've got the option of a spare motor if you're lucky, a paddle if the boat's small enough to paddle, or even perhaps throwing an anchor and doing what they call kedging, where you just throw an anchor as far as you can, pull the boat towards the anchor, lift it up, throw it again. It's hard work, but it is a way to get a boat from A to B. It particularly works well if a boat's in really shallow water. Alright, well take care. I hope you never need this video, and I'll see you soon. Bye.